Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Melissa Rebronja. I'm an integrative healing practitioner and host at healyourheart.love. And today we have a very special guest, Dr. Alka Arora. Welcome, Dr. Alka.
Thank you, Melissa. Wonderful to be here.
Yeah, it's a real honor and pleasure. Dr. Alka Arora is a full-time faculty member in the Women's Spirituality Program at the California Institute of Integral Studies, as well as a public speaker, life coach, and workshop facilitator. Her life's work is about birthing a new form of feminism rooted in respect for the sacred, a commitment to healing among the genders and justice for all beings, including our animal kin. As a thought leader on feminist spirituality and transformative education, she inspires diverse audiences to imagine new ways of being. I love that. She has spoken at over 40 national and international conferences, such as the Parliament of World Religions, National Women's Studies Association, American Academy of Religion, and International Leadership Association. She has also been a speaker at Wisdom 2.0, the CIIS Big Ideas podcast series, as well as numerous local and regional events. For more info, go to alkaaurora.com.
Thank you, Melissa.
You're welcome. It's a real pleasure to have you. We met because I was considering doing the master's program in women's spirituality, and you were one of the faculty, and just love the program. Is it true that it's one of the only ones in the country?
The only program to offer a PhD in women's spirituality.
It's kind of sad that that's the reality, and wonderful that you are part of it and you're doing this work. So on behalf of all the women of the world, thank you, Dr. Alka. Yes.
Thank you, Melissa. I want to say, yes, it is in a way unfortunate that there aren't more programs explicitly doing this, but I think the positive, hopeful piece is that being in this field of women's studies for decades, I have seen in the field of women's studies that there is more openness happening in many corners of bringing spirituality into that conversation. So even though they might not be offering a degree with this title, I think that the scholarship is growing in many, many places.
Beautiful. I'm so happy to hear that. So tell us, how did you get into the field of women's spirituality and women's studies?
Yeah. Well, I have a very unusual journey, believe it or not. I started my educational career as a math major.
Oh, okay. So you're smart.
Well, it's funny. That's what, people would say. I had someone say, I thought you were smart. Why did you leave math? I thought, well, I wanted more of a challenge.
Right.
So I went to USC, and while I was there, I took some gender studies courses, and it just lit me up in a way that math wasn't able to, in terms of just like understanding my own experience as, of course, at that time as a young woman, trying to make sense of things in the world, understanding the gender roles that I had been raised with as a first generation Indian American woman. Just gave me like a passion, And then when I went to grad school in women's studies, I also was sort of concurrently going through a spiritual quest. And while I was finding that my academic work was really helping me sort of develop my activism and develop my political consciousness, my spiritual practice felt very separate from that. I was exploring meditation and philosophy and all sorts of things, but that part of my life felt very separate from my feminism.
Right.
And so, I ended up deciding to write my dissertation on women's spiritual activism and how they were bringing their spirituality and their feminist consciousness together. And so one thing led to another. I found out about this program at CIIS, and I'm so grateful to the 4 mothers who came before me to found this program. So it just felt like the right fit for me.
Beautiful. I love that. I love your website. It's so educational, and there's so many elements of you. So I'd love to talk about, how do you define feminist consciousness? I just love the words, even like feminine consciousness. Like, yes, we need more of that, because I've been starved most of my life living in patriarchy, right?
Right.
So just these words.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very deep question.
Right.
It's a good question.
Yes.
I would say that, for the first step for someone developing a feminist consciousness is just this recognition that business as usual is not what we've been taught to believe, that it's normal and natural for only certain groups of men to be in power, for women to be objectified, for such a deep imbalance in power and values. So it starts with just this recognition that, whatever you might be struggling with, whether you're, even for men, whether you're a woman or a man or non-binary, that this is not necessarily how it has to be, right? That this is something, patriarchy was something that was created historically. It's been around a long time, but it doesn't mean that that's just normal and natural in the way that, quote, God made it, right? So that's the start, by saying, this isn't just me, this is a societal problem.
Yeah.
And then it's also like, coupled with that is the belief that systems can change.
Yes.
Right? And I think we've seen, just in our lifetimes, so much change happening in a rise of feminist consciousness. We still have so far to go in terms of gaining true liberation and equity, but we've seen change. So we know that change can happen.
Right.
I would add, it's also a challenge, not just to sexism and heterosexism, but to what Brianne Eisler calls dominator paradigms. So that's like racism, classism, ableism, all of the isms, xenophobia, nationalism, in some of my work, speciesism, right? So looking at that, there's a dominator paradigm in how human beings are relating to Earth and other animals.
Right.
Yeah, and so we see the word coming up a lot these days on intersectionality, which means that we understand that our experiences as women are also deeply connected for each person to our experiences of what race and culture and age and all of the other sort of systems that pervade our society, right? And we can't just tackle one issue. We have to look at things from an interconnected, multi-pronged lens.
Yeah, thank you for that. And, as I'm looking back at my education, and I do remember when I was in university, there was women's studies, but there was a part of me that there was almost this embarrassment, or there was something like, ooh, so there's a stigma around that. Yeah. And that's sad. And I kind of wish I could go back and, talk to myself and say, yes, take this. And also, I know that in our conversations, we talked about having my YouTube channel, having this fear of having a playlist that's for women. There's like a part of me that is very protective and scared to be open about, being fully in every way a woman, right? And so I wonder what you have to say about that.
Well, first of all, thank you for naming that. And I want to normalize your experience too by saying, I think this is so true for so many women, but this is also true for anyone who's been oppressed by any reason, that there's always, when people start to stand up for their rights and their dignity, there's a backlash that happens.
Yeah.
And so, I think we're roughly the same, we're from the same generation.
Yes.
When I first started getting into women's studies, I remember I would just be hanging out with people socially. And when I said what I was studying, oftentimes there was this like immediate reaction. Oh, do you hate men?
Right. Or are you a lesbian? Right.
Right. As if there's something wrong with being a lesbian.
Right.
Also, right.
Exactly.
Right. So there's this like heterosexism and homophobia, like baked into that as well. Or if they know that you're straight, it's like, oh, because you can't get a man. Or like there's all of this like baggage put on it, right?
Absolutely.
But we have to understand that that's their. I'm not saying it's like people sit around a room and say, okay, how are we going to like bring women down? But it's this unconscious process that happens, that when any oppressed group starts to assert itself, that there's sort of a, like I said, a backlash, right? An effort to deflate the movement.
Yes.
And I think that's one of the things that happens, right?
Makes sense.
I think also, in terms of maybe more specifically about women in the feminist movement, is that partly it's conditioning, partly it's just part of human nature, is we're relational beings.
Yes.
Right. And so it can be very scary to think about losing connection, right? If you are sort of like stigmatized and you're put in the out group because you identify as a feminist, or you're very vocal about women's rights.
Yeah, absolutely. I can relate to that.
Yeah, and so I think that's a really powerful issue, but I also want to say that like oftentimes when we have a protective response, there's a reason for that. And it's also because violence has been done to women, right,
Yes.
who have been outspoken. I mean, you hear these days, I'm not in the public eye enough to get at this point, but many people who have spoken out publicly about things, they get hate mail, they
Yeah.
get internet death threats, they get trolls, all of this sort of thing, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. It's very sad that that
Yeah.
is the case. I also noticed in my own life, I've been interviewing people, I think for the last, I want to say 20 years, but maybe 15, I don't know. First in the music
Mhm.
industry, and then in the fields of spirituality and healing. And now
Mhm.
I'm opening the avenue to sacred feminine.
Mhm.
And I do realize that there was a unconscious part of me that has put men on a pedestal, right? Like going to
Mhm.
men for advice, going to men.
Mhm.
And I didn't even realize it. And I'm like, oh my
Yeah.
goodness, I've interviewed more men than women. So
Yeah.
part of me wants to balance that out. And it's happening naturally because I'm just meeting all these amazing women these days. I'm like,
Right.
oh, wow, it's like wonderful. And then I've been on the receiving end. I used to sell cars
Mhm.
at one point in my life, and I literally had people reject me because I'm a woman, because they
Mm.
want to go to a man.
Mhm.
So it's
Mhm.
very interesting, these ideas of men and women and gender roles.
Well, I think this really, ends up segueing into a conversation about like feminist spirituality, because I think if from a young age we're conditioned to see men in leadership roles, whether that's as, the religious leaders, the political leaders, the presidents, we still haven't had a female president in the United
Right.
States, heads of companies, as the scientists, the philosophers, right? It becomes sort of an unconscious imprint that
Hmm.
men have more knowledge and they're going to know more.
Right. And I'm finding out that's not the case.
Yeah.
Not to be, so it's not about going like that. It's just more like, why are we conditioned to elevate? And of course, I have the
Mhm.
answers myself. It's the patriarchy, that's the conditioning. What is the process of deconditioning in your work that you do with
Mhm.
women?
Yeah. Well, there's so many levels to that. I think one is at the symbolic level, and I think that's somehow, I mean, one factor of the foundation of the Women's Spirituality Program is when we recognize that, um, prior to patriarchal religion in many parts of the world, it was a goddess that was supreme, that was venerated.
Yeah, yeah,
And even in other traditions where there are both male and female deities,
mhm,
right? So it does something, I think, to women's psyche to see ourselves represented as divine, first
yes,
of all,
yeah,
right? And I think that it's also about reclaiming the historical figures who have been geniuses and leaders and experts, and knowing that in many cases, it's not because men are innately more talented, but we're given more opportunities. Many, many years ago, I was traveling in Europe to Austria, and I found out that there was this whole movement afoot to lift up Mozart's sister, who was
oh,
also a musical genius, right? But
yeah,
didn't get the opportunity and the attention in history till recently. And I think that that's part of it. I think it's also surrounding ourselves with women who lift us up and we lift them up. And it's recognizing that so much of what we've been taught is really based in a lie,
yeah,
right? The
absolutely,
lie of male superiority, which is just like the lie of white superiority or Western superiority. And
absolutely,
as you said, it's not about saying, well, no, it's women that are superior. It's saying, why do we have to say that there's one superior gender or one superior race? It's that we're all part of the tapestry of sentient life.
absolutely. And women's spirituality would be considered part of the hidden histories, because I
Yeah.
wish I learned this in school. I wish I didn't even know about goddesses until, I'm embarrassed to say, like 5 years ago or so, in terms of like really diving deeper and understanding the history. And
Because it's not very well known. In recent years, I think there's been more of a movement afoot to reclaim, pagan practices and earth-based practices. And I would say in certain circles, the word feminist has become destigmatized. I think it depends on what part of the country you're in, whether it's more
yes,
of a red state or a blue state. But I think among more sort of liberal left-oriented people, the word has lost some of its stigma.
Yeah, I can see that. And I'm so glad. And I hope that that spreads. I hope it becomes just a word that if I feel into it, it just means that you care about empowering your mother, daughter, sister. You care about them having a good life. Yeah, I don't see the negativity, but I feel it in my body that like, I'm scared.
Yeah.
Am I going to be like,
Yeah, am I going to be attacked? Am I going to
yeah,
be cut out? Am I going to be
yeah,
seen as undesirable in some way?
right. Yeah, there's so much that's attached to it. So I'm glad to hear that it is being destigmatized, and I can feel that too. Yeah. What is the path of the sacred feminine? You have that on your website, and it's just so there's so like a path of the sacred feminine.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, I think there are many paths, but the way that I understand it, and first I want to step back and say, some people find this language of feminine and masculine a bit antiquated. I personally think that there's value to it if we understand them as energies and recognizing that whether you're a man or a woman or trans or non-binary, we all have these different energies within us if we think of them as sort of archetypal energies. But to me, the path of the sacred feminine, it's a path that is really grounded in not just seeking to transcend to another world or wait for the afterlife, but really grounding into the day-to-day, our embodiment, our relationships. It's honoring the spectrum of embodiment, and it's particularly those bodies that have been denigrated and vilified under patriarchy. It's also lifting up. I mean, I'm not personally a mother, but I also think part of the path is like lifting up motherhood, not putting it up on a pedestal, but like recognizing it as a sacred gift and a sacred aspect of so many women's lives, right? And the seasons of our bodies and the different phases that we go through from being young women to then stepping into adulthood and then going into more of our crone years and all of that, and like really deeply respecting that.
Yes.
And I think a lot of it is a path of reclaiming female deities, reclaiming female divinities, female language, reclaiming our connection to the earth.
Yeah.
Yeah. What
Beautiful.
is it for you, Melissa?
Well, I have I co-facilitated a summit called Sacred Body. So when you mentioned the word embodiment, it feels like owning my feminine self, beauty, life, everything. It's interesting because when I was a little girl, I remember feeling the projection or the conditioning, because I just always had this question, why am I being treated differently? Why am I being told that I can't do that? So there was a part of me that was always competing with boys, like being fearless, doing that. And
Yes.
I was a bit of a tomboy because there was already a part of me trying to prove like, hey, I'm not different. I'm not different.
Yeah.
Even getting to a place where not wanting to be feminine at all, like not wanting to be a boy in a way, like nothing feminine, like because feminine was yucky. It's so weird and so sad. So
Yeah.
deconditioning that, and then more like celebrating
Yeah.
being a woman and in every way, having a period, right?
Yeah.
Celebrating, welcoming the changes, like who we are in every way, right?
Right, right, absolutely. And I'm so glad you shared that story, and thank you, because I relate to that to a certain extent as well. Because I think for, smart women, girls who like to think for themselves, we are so inundated with those messages about what the feminine is, and it's like subservient and it's weak, and it's like, well, I'm not that.
Right. So I was like, I don't fit in that, but you're telling me I'm that, right? That I can't do, but that's not yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing that I want to say about the path of the sacred feminine, or just this whole idea of the feminine masculine, is like for women to be able to embrace both aspects of ourselves, the masculine and the feminine. But I think this path can be very profound for men who allow themselves to be open to it. Because one of the, I think the biggest wounding that happens to boys and men is the tamping down of anything that's deemed feminine within them, right? The
Sure.
whole boys don't cry thing, right?
Absolutely.
The vulnerability, the sharing of their struggles, any interests that are considered feminine, right? Men have gotten so much bullying for that, right?
Yes.
That we need to
Absolutely.
uplift these qualities, whether they're men or women or people who are trans or whatever. And, there's a really interesting trans scholar by the name of Julia Serrano who has said that even in LGBTQ communities, there has been a suppression of the feminine, right? That the masculine identified are valued more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think it's a really interesting point that she's making, that we need to uplift the feminine no matter what form it comes through.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm just reminded of a story within my own family system. Is my little nephew, when he was about, trying to remember, 6, 7 years old, he wanted to take up dancing because his mother was, going to dancing school. And my brother had a real reaction to that. No, because I don't know what he said, but I guess he was worried, is my child gay or right? And then my nephew, as a little boy, stood up to him and he said, oh yeah, he was buying dancing shoes for his dance class.
Right.
And he stood up to my brother and said, no, this is my money, because he saved it up and this is what I want to do.
Yeah.
And he spent a few years dancing and he was a wonderful little dancer and he grew out of it. So I just remember that moment, how beautiful that is, that as a little kid, he stood up to that judgment or that stigma of that boys shouldn't dance, or that's a sign. And I think my brother's thinking was he was worried about him being bullied, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's coming from a
Right.
concern, like it's better I do something about it now, or yeah. And that is so sad, right? That young boys can't
Right.
explore some avenues that are considered, oh, well, that's for girls, right? Or that's feminine.
Right.
It's just, yeah.
And there's actually more stigma for boys who are feminine than for girls who are masculine in some ways.
Right.
Yeah, which speaks to how much the feminine is devalued.
Right. Yeah. So we need more of this work. We need more people like you.
And you?
Yeah. And me, thank you. I'd like to ask you about the division that exists within feminine circles, right? I'm noticing that there's feminists that are transphobic, and the label is TERF, which means trans, exclusionary, and then
radical feminist.
There you go, radical feminist. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a very complicated question.
I know it's right. Yeah.
So, but I will kind of preface it by saying, I'm not going to be able to get into sort of all the nuances of that sort of schism, but I will say that there has been a history within the certain sectors of the feminist movement of being believing very adamantly that there is something sort of inherently dangerous about male bodies and men because of, like the amount of male violence that we've seen in our world.
Yes.
Right. And I think that's really where trans exclusionary radical feminism, there were feminist philosophers like Mary Daly and I think Z Budapest also, who just felt very strongly that someone who was born in a male body could not truly ever be a woman, or if they did, they were kind of taking something away from women.
Right. Okay.
And that's where that sort of term, and that was a term that women never said about themselves, that they were TERFs, right?
Right. So it's a sort of like controversial thing. Yeah. Okay.
But what's interesting is in sort of the culture wars that we're in is that some women or people are called TERFs who don't even identify as feminists, much less radical feminists.
Right.
So it's become this term that's sort of been overgeneralized. I think that, at least in the circles that I'm in, there is more of an understanding that sexism and heterosexism and transphobia are all connected. And that if we want to seek our liberation as women, we have to also fight for the liberation of everyone, right?
Yeah,
And
that makes sense to me.
being gender non-conforming or trans is, it's just as natural and normal a part of the human experience as being gay or lesbian or straight or
Yes.
heterosexual, right?
Yeah.
I think, however, there is some attention that comes in at times when women who are identified as women are seeking to reclaim aspects of our embodiment, such as you mentioned, menstruation or motherhood, or, so many things that have been vilified in patriarchy. And there's this new movement coming up saying, don't say that women menstruate because, not all women do, because trans women don't, or, or some men menstruate.
Right. Wow. Yeah, that's so complex. Right.
And I think that, we really need to have more dialogue across those differences rather than hurling these like accusations against each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I feel like there needs to be room for you and I to reclaim those as part of our women's experiences without erasing the language of womanhood,
Yeah.
while also being allies to those who are trans.
Yes. Yes. That's how I feel. Like I can see sort of all sides, like it all makes sense, but I'm not kind of like decided. I always kind of think of like, okay, if there was a war, whose side would you be on? It's like,
Yeah.
I don't know. I love everyone, right? So
Yeah.
it's like I get this side and I get this side. And how can
Right.
we learn from each other and be together and rather this or that, be this and that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's where affinity groups come into play, women being with women, trans women being with trans women, because the journey is different, right?
Well, I think it depends what they're organizing around,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
think that there are many situations where, we can just, anyone who identifies as a woman is part of that group, right? But
Right.
then there's also, spaces where people who are trans or non-gender conforming will want to organize around
Yeah.
some of
Depending on like what we're organizing for, right?
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we're living in times that are very divisive in some ways. And I do think that that's unfortunate because I think we need to be able to have productive conversations about these things without it being so polarized. Like you said, like there's a war and you have to pick a side. And it's like, well, actually, some of these things are much more nuanced than you're like transphobic or you're believe that gender shouldn't exist or something, like, because I've
Right.
had someone when I was doing work around with this organization on gender equity and reconciliation many years ago, they said, well, why don't we just need to abolish gender? And I said, how can we abolish gender? It's like, to me, it's like part of human expression,
Yeah.
right? And we need to honor various forms of gender expression, but I don't want to just flatten us all out as if we're all have the same experience. Yeah. And I think that there is something to be valued in just our embodiment as well, kind of circling back to that issue, right?
Yeah.
That we can certainly identify and be treated the way that matches our internal feeling of gender, but there is a materiality to our body that's also going to affect how we show up in the world.
Yes.
And interestingly, many trans authors have also spoken about, once I've taken hormones, I feel a different form of energy moving within me,
Interesting. Yeah.
right?
Huh.
Which I think
Yeah.
also lends credence to it's a very complex interaction between nature, culture, nurture, experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is very complex. And I have compassion and openness towards people that are on a different journey from me. Absolutely. And I
Absolutely.
think that's so important. Can I just for a moment pause and imagine what that journey would be like? And also, if I don't know, rather than making assumptions, can I just step back and listen and ask rather than projecting, right?
Beautifully said. Perfect.
Yeah.
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 Thank you.
Yeah.
So, what is feminist spiritual activism and transformative feminist leadership?
Yeah.
I love all of that.
Yeah.
For
Those
more,
are,
go to Alka's website.
yeah. Those are things I'm trying to figure out every day.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of start with this concept of spiritual activism or sacred activism, which are terms that are sort of bubbling up in certain I would say, social justice circles in the past several decades, which is about how, at least in the West, I think more so than maybe in other nations, movements for progressive social change have been very much divorced from religion or spirituality. Or even if when they haven't been, that link hasn't always been respected or understood, right? So spiritual activism is recognizing that for many, many people, there is a profound link between our spiritual values and the social justice work that we do. Right? Sometimes this link comes from things like, being guided by divine guidance or by intuition, or just by, the values of, like you said, compassion, the values of human interconnectedness, right? These things that guide our work in the world. I think that's also very relevant when we talk about feminist activism, right? Like, are we undertaking this from a purely, political sense of, equal pay and equal rights, which I think are very important, but do we also want to look at some of those, like the symbolic structures, how religion has been patriarchal, how we need to reclaim, the feminine spiritual path,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
As a form of reclaiming that in and of itself is a form of activism and social change.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And the reason I said this is a question that I'm asking myself every day is because I think when I was younger and a little bit more righteous about my politics,
Yes.
I used to almost believe that, like, God or goddess is picking a political party, right?
Right.
And I think there's a danger in becoming too attached to some of our political views and thinking that they're divinely.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
That's what happened with, fundamentalism, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And
Well,
then that's,
separation of church and state, basically, right?
yeah,
Yeah. So
because that
important.
link, right, exactly. And the reason that there was that split in social justice communities between the political and spiritual is because there was no split in fundamentalist societies, right? Or like theocracies, or nations that are like built on no separation, right?
Yes.
It
Yeah.
becomes very dangerous.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think for those of us who are more on the liberal or progressive end, we also have to be aware of a potential fundamentalism and thinking that
Oh,
our way of thinking is always right in every situation.
absolutely. And I think what we need more of is acceptance of other ways of thinking and normalizing that. That's different. And how can we
Yeah.
meet together rather than just righteously saying you're wrong, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that when we think about spiritual activism, the way that some feminist theorists have thought about it, like I'm thinking of a queer Latina feminist scholar named Gloria Anzaldúa, who, was publishing a lot in the 80s and I think maybe 90s as well, who's passed away, was really about moving beyond that sort of opposite, split consciousness, or what her colleague Anna Louise Keating calls an oppositional consciousness, right? Like we were saying about the, the trans debate,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
It's always being at war, they're always being in that spirit.
Right.
And really trying to undertake social change with more of a, like, staying true to our convictions, but also being open to listening, as you said. Right?
Yeah, learning.
And to learning and to dialogue and to growing and to changing our minds. And I think a key piece of that as well is, even if you walk away from that, like, still vehemently disagreeing with someone's views, to not demonize them as a person.
Yes.
To still respect their innate humanity and dignity.
That's so important, right? Yeah.
So I want to segue into the second part of your question, which was on another concept that I often speak and teach about, which is transformative feminist leadership. And it's really bringing this idea that leadership isn't something that just happens when you're in a formal position of power, but it happens through the way that you live your daily life. And one of my colleagues at the California Institute of Integral Studies has written a lot about transformative leadership. His name is Alfonso Monturi. But I bring in this, like, feminist lens to that, as a feminist leader, I mean, yes, it can be great to be running a political campaign or in charge of a nonprofit or an academic institution or grassroots campaign, but it's also the way that we lead our day-to-day lives. Like you mentioned your nephew, right? So, speaking to your brother and saying, let's empower him to go to that dance class or to do whatever. Like
Yeah.
that is enacting a form of feminist leadership.
Yes. I love that. Yeah.
Because you're taking your values and your vision for social change and enacting it in your day-to-day life with every choice that you make.
Yeah. And being conscious of the choices that we're making and aware, because there's so much that happens that we're unconscious.
Yeah,
Like me not realizing that I'm interviewing more men than women. And then
exactly.
going, oh my gosh, right?
And so it becomes a daily process, and we all make missteps, and the opportunities that we take and the opportunities that we miss. But being able to interrupt the sexist comment or the racist comment, or to, mentor the young woman, or,
Yeah.
give an opportunity to the trans person, or, to do these things, which in a way ends up really is how social change happens. It's
hmm
when many of us are doing these in our daily lives.
hmm And which leads me to how can we, ordinary folk, use this knowledge in our day-to-day life, right?
So I think, as you mentioned, it's like awareness, right? Kind of like paying more attention to questions just like you did. Oh, like, wait a second. I just noticed I just interviewed 5 men in a row. What's that about?
Right, yeah.
Or if you're a student, to say, gosh, this class seems to have mostly white authors.
Yeah.
What is that about?
Yes.
And like, so that first step is just the noticing. And then the second step is to say, wait a second, like what do I not know here? Whose voices am I not hearing? What do I need to do to research, right? Like for
Yes.
you, like again, who are the women that I want to be interviewing?
Yes.
It could even be in how we relate to ourselves, right? Like I notice that, when I get together with my friends, we all talk about how we need to lose weight. It's
hmm
like maybe I can start to interrupt that conversation and just say,
Right.
wow, isn't it amazing that we're healthy enough to go on this hike together? And let's honor our bodies for what they can do,
Right. Yeah. Interrupting that. Absolutely. Yeah. Beautiful.
and how we talk to ourselves,
hmm
and showing more self compassion to ourselves and to others.
Yeah. Like, how do you treat the woman within, the goddess within, right?
Yeah.
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 So how can people work with you? I know that you're doing so many wonderful things. You're a faculty, so the program can be checked out. It's a beautiful program, and
hmm
it's a master's and PhD. Is that correct?
Yes. For those who are interested in either a master's or PhD in the field of women's spirituality, they're welcome to check out www.cis.edu. And I don't know if there's in the show notes or anything like that. We can put in the
Yeah, I'll
website.
put links for all of that.
But of course, not everyone is at a place in their lives where they want or need an academic degree, which is why I began doing more coaching work.
hmm
So I do general life coaching, leadership coaching for anyone who is interested in exploring more of these ideas in their own life, figuring out maybe where their next steps are, getting guidance on what they might want to read or listen to, or explore some of that internal work within themselves. So they're welcome to reach out to me at my email, which is alka@alkaaurora.com, or sign up for my newsletter, which they can do on my website.
Beautiful. Thank you. Your website is awesome, so I encourage everyone to go check it out and see all the wonderful things you're doing. And is there anything that you'd like to share that we haven't talked about yet?
One things that we haven't had a chance to talk much more about is my work around veganism and anti-speciesism. And that's a whole other sort of dimension of my work, which again, I used to see my care for animals and passion for ending animal exploitation as sort of a parallel thing. And the past decade or so, I've really seen the connection between how we abuse the earth and non-human animals, and how that's so related to this dominator paradigm, which patriarchy is founded in.
Yes.
And one of the things that's often missing from the climate change conversation, even though it's really a well-known established fact, is that animal agriculture is one of the leading causes of man-made climate change, if not the leading cause.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah, again, this is
Yeah.
not,
Right.
we know about
Yeah.
carbon and
Yeah.
driving and flying, and those things are part of it too. but factory farming and animal agriculture is a major driver. And so I really encourage folks to learn more about that, to really think deeply about how all of our relationships, not just our relationships with other humans. And if they're interested in learning more, to reach out to me or to explore that piece of my website.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that important piece. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Alka, for being
Thank
our
you,
guest.
Melissa. I really appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to many more conversations and collaborations.
Thank you. And hopefully we have you back for more.